Implementing. So you've done the searching, you've gone through the procurement process, whatever that looks like for your particular institution, you have selected, you have entered a contract. We are now implementing. So, six sort of major things to think through as you move through this implementation process. Step one for you, get to know the new CMS because the new CMS is going to dictate quite a bit of how you approach and use it, but it's also going to inform like the immediate things you need to do, like getting your data ready to exit your old system and get into the new system. Step two, prepare for CMS implementation logistics. So this can encompass like where the digital files need to be migrated to so that they can be accessed by the new system. This could be setting up single sign-on, security and verification for staff to log into the new system, things like that. Step three, learn how data will and content will export. So export from your old system, but we're also going to need, we're also going to need to think about what that import piece looks like and what your export, what format and shape that needs to be in for that future import. There will be testing and troubleshooting, of course, especially when it comes to data migration. The last thing you want is to lose half of the data because it didn't make it in there, or it makes it in there but not in the right place. Step five, any sort of cleanup. All of us have data and past practices that could use some sort of cleanup, and usually this migration to new CMS is where that comes to light and becomes a priority. And then six, establishing or reestablishing best practices. So always when switching to a new system, there's going to be different decisions that we want to make. There's going to be best practices we either need to or want to recommit to, or perhaps choose a different method or standardization. So this is a perfect time to revisit that, and if they haven't already, to codify the best practices at your institution. So step one, getting to know the new CMS, watch the tutorials. Many of the CMS vendors often have many videos now, a lot of them on YouTube, in terms of where to find things, how to do a particular functionality. So especially if it's a proprietary product, those likely exist. And actually, in the open source, there are so many great institutions out there who have been so generous in recording and are on YouTube. So even open source, I think you'll find some good stuff. Read the literature. It may perhaps be the most dry and most boring thing to read, but at least get a PDF so you can do some keyword searching for the functionality that has the most impact on your job. I recommend attending the demos and or trainings. So once you've signed on to a product, there will be periodic demos of new product functionality, or to help with a particular process that is a bit more technically complex. I recommend attending those if they're topically appropriate for you. And many of the trainings at this point, especially for proprietary products, they'll have some sort of training library at this point, which will have on-demand videos. You don't necessarily need to wait and sign up or try and schedule training. I recommend viewing examples, whether that is vendor-provided examples or if you have peer museums who are using the same system. It can be incredibly informative to see how a similar museum is using the product that you're now starting to get to know. And then playing in the sandbox. If the system has some sort of like shared groups sandbox, or if there's an area of testing you can do within your own system, knowing where those are and if that is possible, because the most effective learning method is typically the exploring and doing type method. So having a place where you can safely do that is very important. Step two, prepare for implementation. So if you're working with a vendor, software as a service, having that pre-implementation meeting is going to be really critical, where everybody understands what is happening and why. Reviewing those implementation procedures, especially if you're getting a more proprietary product, there's going to be a set of procedures in terms of the activities and timeline, as well as system requirements. If you are on your own, thinking through with the relevant procurement team and technology staff, the steps that need to happen in order to install and implement an open source product. You will need to walk through anticipated implementation steps. Some open source products are pretty thoroughly documented, so there may be some resources there for you. Otherwise, you may need to create your own based on your understanding of how the system works and needs to be implemented. I recommend speaking to each person and what their part in the process will be at this point, especially if it's being self-guided, and then identifying what needs to be in place. So these are things that typically the vendor would help out with or support with, but if it's open source, you may be on your own. So step 3, learn how the data and content exports, and essentially knowing what format it needs to be in to then be imported into the new system. So knowing the shape of the data as it comes out of the old system, as well as like how the digital files come out and what that looks like and what shape you need to get it in. Data will typically come out, the most common tends to be like a CSV, comma separated value spreadsheet. So as long as column headers are mapped accurately to the new system, then that is a good first start. Depending on how stringent the field formatting needs to be, you may find you still need to do data cleanup because the field formatting is different and perhaps more stringent than the system you were in previously. And similar with digital files, depending on the system you are in, some systems for some very, I'm sure it was a good reason at the time, but they do like a triangulation of like a reference key for, they're putting the digital files over here, but they're only giving the object record the digital file key. They're not actually like attaching the object to that record. So sometimes you actually need to do that triangulation for the new system. Otherwise, they're going to have no way to connect the digital file with your object record. So stuff like that is important to figure out how it comes out of the old system and then what it needs to be in to get into the new system. So testing export is incredibly important. In fact, I recommend doing it while you're shopping just because that can have such an impact on the implementation piece. I recommend checking the quality of the type of data that you're getting out of your system because sometimes the way we see it in the system is different than how it comes out and is not necessarily usable. I recommend the identification of any critical data cleanup, especially if it's unable to migrate into the new system and you're going to lose it otherwise. Also think about how to ensure new CMS structure in its setup and making sure that the migration piece is having the data go to the correct places in setup. Doing test data and content importing, so testing the shape of that data and content you have getting into the new system to see if you need to adjust exporting, and then checking the quality and adjust as needed. So it's going to be sort of a trial and error, especially for the first couple of times. But getting to know the shape of your data, how it comes out, and what shape it needs to be in is incredibly important for this implementation process. Step 4, test and troubleshoot. So just like a rinse and repeat until everything is working as it should. If you are continually running into issues and you're working with a vendor, ask the vendor. That's what they're there for. They have seen many, many different sorts of migrations and implementing new systems. They will likely have seen this type of thing happen before and can at least offer some insight as you are doing it. And step 5, cleanup. So this part will usually always come up in data migration. It's up to you in terms of like how deeply you want to get into data cleanup as you migrate things into the new system. Sometimes the data is easier to clean up in aggregate in a spreadsheet. Other times it's easier just to wait for the data to get into the new system to use cleanup functionality. But things to think about. So data entered does not adhere to local professional standards. Very common problem, maybe something you want to address at this time. When the data exits the system, sometimes it loses cohesion, for lack of a better word, or there's things that you know are in the system that's not present, so it's not exporting correctly. Or when the data enters the new system, it's either losing or adding data for some reason that should or should not be present. So there's a few different points in the process where data could be missing something, not meeting standards, being corrupt through part of the process. Number of different ways, but things to keep in mind, and add to the cleanup list depending on what you're finding. And then 6, establishing or reestablishing best practices. Even if you're moving to a very similar collections management system, it's always good to reestablish a best practice, especially if there are specific ways you're going to use a field or a particular functionality that is not necessarily specified for that field, or that not everyone would necessarily know. It's important to document so that as people start using the new system, it can stay as consistent as possible, because consistent data is the most effective and successful data for search and discovery. Things to think about. Where is the data stored at each step? And what I mean by that is, where is the data stored when it's in the CMS? Where is the data stored when I take it out? Which local computer, hard drive, Dropbox? And then where is the data going to get into the new system? For example, some vendors, it needs to go through an FTP, for example. And then where is the data stored once it goes into that new CMS? So having a clear understanding at each step, and also ensuring you have plenty of storage depending on those different steps as you move through the implementation process. Another thing to think about is, how long do you keep the old system to overlap with the new system? This is especially important if you know the implementation and that data migration piece is going to take a few months. There's likely going to then be a few months of overlap where you have that new CMS, you're getting it up and running, but you still need your old CMS to provide access while you're waiting. Next one, to what level of detail do you keep decision makers in the loop? Because this can be a very technical process, sometimes it's just not necessarily to give the level of detail that we're living in this current area. So just sort of gauge your communication level appropriately. How will you migrate and test the data? So having that data migration and testing plan in place. And then what external systems rely on the CMS, and how will their connection be addressed? So thinking about, if you're contributing to something like Digital Public Libraries of America, so some sort of like collection portal, or thinking about if the museum artifacts in the CMS are linked to a LibGuide, or some sort of other like museum exhibitions publication, for example. Knowing where those connections are and then updating them so that they're not lost from the user perspective. A note about funding. So because this process can be long and because it can be costly, at least with just the one-time fees, let alone the annual fees, there are some different federal grants that are available that could help you go through at least part of the process. The most common federal ones are Institute of Museum and Library Services, IMLS, National Park Service, National Endowment for Humanities, Council on Library and Information Research, and then at the state level, each state gets Library Services and Technology Act funding, so it's federal funding but distributed through a state entity. And quite a few of the, it's LSTA is the acronym, quite a few of those grants I've worked with clients on to go through this procurement process. When to consider an expert. So we covered a lot of both technical and like process specific things. There's not just the shopping for a new product, there's also a data migration piece to consider. It can be incredibly complex and time consuming. So when does it make sense to work with an expert or some sort of outside person to lead you through this process? So I recommend if it's been like 5+ years since the last CMS procurement, whether it was you but at a different museum, that experience is still very helpful. But if none of you have been through one in the last 5 years, then it can be helpful to have that outside perspective, even just to know the current market. If staff availability is limited, which like it almost always is, but just knowing how much capacity it takes in doing just the shopping and selection, let alone like that implementation and migration piece. If there isn't expertise or availability of experts on the team, so you as a museum expert, you are definitely still an expert. It doesn't necessarily mean you're a CMS expert. So having a CMS expert on the team can be very helpful. If there's any sort of complication factors involved, so whether that is there's multiple partners in the system or that need to be in the system, like different organization partners, if there's mixed collections, like it's a museum collection, but also an archives collection, and maybe we're moving two systems into one system, or the back end or front end needs heavy customization, any and all of those aspects like immediately up level the complexity on not just searching for and selecting a product, but then also implementing that product. And then a couple other things that may mean an expert would be helpful to have on your side is if you want someone to lead you through the process. So it's the process heavy piece is one you'd like somebody to actually do the heavy lifting on. And or you need an outside expert to use as an advocacy tool with decision makers. This is also something that is common with clients that I work with. It may be that they've gone through somewhat of an informal CMS shopping process previously, but the decision makers or admin above want them to go through it with an outside consultant before a formal recommendation is made. It is common, though I definitely share peer frustration in not being listened to if you've already made a decision.